Baroness Eliza Manningham-Buller, welcome to the podcast. It's a delight to have you. Your father was a Member of Parliament, became the Attorney General in Harold Macmillan's government, and indeed, in my outer office, there's a portrait of him. So no doubt you had another look this morning as you came in on that. And your mother, I believe, that she bred carrier pigeons for intelligence purposes.
Yes.
So could you expand on that?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. And this room that we're in was my father's office, so it's familiar to me. Yes, in the war, my mother did work that was secret. She trained carrier pigeons, which you don't actually need to train them, you just need to take them further and further away from their loft, and they fly home. And then during the Second World War, the pigeons were dropped in wicker baskets or little slings with parachutes to occupied France and brought back messages strapped to their ankles, and she would then ring the War Office and somebody would come and collect the message. It was a story in our family which I always thought must be apocryphal, that one of her pigeons had brought back information on the V2 site at Peenemünde, which was then bombed by the RAF. But actually, I subsequently discovered that there was a record of this, and it was true. And her pigeon got the Dickin Medal for that. I rather like that only the British give medals to animals.
And going on from there, you went to university, and I believe that your first job was with MI5, but you weren't too sure what the department was and why you were there.
I did a very brief, I did 3 years before that teaching, purely because I couldn't bear the idea of giving up long summer holidays. And then I saw somebody at a party and said I was looking for a new job. And he said, why don't you go and see somebody in room 055 in the War Office, which I did. And I joined, as actually I think Jonathan Evans said to you, what I thought was an independent branch of the Ministry of Defence. And rather stupidly, I didn't cotton on until I was there. So I'm rather ashamed of that.
And you've stayed there almost all your professional life.
I stayed there for 33 years.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And you joined then in 1974 with MI5. You eventually became the Deputy Director in 1997 to 2002, and then the Director General from 2002 to 2007. The 2002 was just a year after 9/11, so that was a very tense time, I believe. And the 1997 to 2002 was at the time of the Irish negotiations, the Good Friday Agreement and whatever. So there's a long history there. Could we break that down? Maybe start with that period in 97 and before.
Yes. I perhaps will go back to 1992 when before that I'd been in the British Embassy in Washington with the responsibility of talking to the American allies about intelligence. And I was brought back to start a new section in London on the collecting intelligence on provisional IRA activity in Maine and Great Britain. The Royal Ulster Constabulary had the lead on that in Northern Ireland, which they retained for many years. But here, the government decided, the Conservative government, to take the responsibility from the Metropolitan Police and give it to us. As you can imagine, this was quite a difficult time because the police, understandably, felt unhappy about it. And I think that autumn, we had, I can't quite remember, but in 1 month, when we were in the lead, something like 16 bomb attacks by the Provisional IRA. Many of your listeners won't remember that, and I think that's good because we move on. But then my organisation was helpful, I hope, in the peace process, encouraging the government to consider, when to move and so on, and what the provisionals were thinking. And looking back on that whole Irish experience, I think it quite remarkable that we ended with Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness getting on well together.
The Chuckle Brothers.
The Chuckle Brothers. I mean, nobody could have ever imagined that. But then in parallel from the early 90s, we'd seen the rise of Islamist terrorism, motivated by the narrative that the West has damaged Islam, it's damaged the Muslim world, and needs to be punished for its iniquity. We had a series of plots from sort of mid-90s onwards, and then 9/11 happened. Now, as I've said before, we were expecting a major attack that autumn, as were the Americans, but we didn't know where or what. But of course, when it happened, we immediately recognised it for what it was. And I went with colleagues to America the next morning to see our American friends. I was the deputy head of the service then, and we discussed the significance of this and what it would mean. And American airspace was closed, and when we flew back and began to deal with not something that was new to us, but was new in the scale of it.
Mm-hmm. Can I take you back to the Irish situation in terms of your involvement in that area? Because intelligence was really important in Northern Ireland. I know from my own experience for a limited period being a minister over there how important it was in that engagement. But you're on record as saying that MI5 is governed by the rule of law. Were there times there where there was a bit of tension between intelligence gathering and the rule of law?
There shouldn't be, because the rule of law is enabling. Mm-hmm. And we sought a law. We sought a law for the security service for MI5 from almost the time I joined. We also sought a parliamentary oversight committee long before we got one. And it wasn't until 1989, which was 70 years after our foundation, that we got the Security Service Act. So a framework of law is important. I think there were mistakes made in Northern Ireland, but the respect for the law and its importance is fundamental to doing intelligence work, because you have under the law powers to intrude into people's privacy. These need to be controlled, authorised, proportionate and necessary, and having a proper legal framework helps that to happen.
You're also on record as saying that in terms of terrorism, that terrorists, not all of them are evil, but the deeds that they do are evil, and it's important to talk to them.
Yes.
Where talking doesn't mean approval. Yes. And you went on to say that the problems are solved not by arms and intelligence, but by politics and economics.
That's my
experience. It seems a very neat way of describing that.
Well,
something which I would subscribe to.
Of course, intelligence plays a role, as does law enforcement, as does criminal prosecutions. All these things matter. But ultimately, if you're looking for a peaceful outcome, it has to involve politics and economics.
But it's very hard for politicians. I remember being in the House of Commons when John Major made the point that it would turn his stomach, and I think he used that phrase, to talk to the IRA. But meanwhile, as we find out, that negotiations were going on. So imagine that's just part and parcel of negotiations if you want to get a peaceful end result.
Also, if you're an intelligence officer, you talk to your friends because they share intelligence with you, but you also need to talk to the people who know what harm they're planning, and you need to find out, if you can, in advance and prevent it.
And the remit you're given from the government, and I was trying to get a bit deeper here, the remit, it's within the rule of law, but the government cannot direct you. I think you're on record as saying that. So I think that's maybe an important safeguard for you.
It's the same as the police. I mean, the decisions on the investigations that the service undertakes are those of the Director General. But you'd be a foolish head of the service if you didn't talk through your priorities and your strategy with the Home Secretary, who's responsible for you in Parliament. But certainly in my experience, no Home Secretary of either of the main political parties sought to direct us. But there were conversations like, shouldn't you prioritise this? Have you thought of doing that? Why don't you? And that I regard as entirely healthy.
Sure. Sure, understand. You also mentioned that the 9/11, when you took over as Director General, the year after 9/11, and you said that Iraq was not related to 9/11.
That's correct. Indeed, Saddam Hussein was hostile to Al-Qaeda as a secular ruler and had its proponents locked up in his appalling jails. And so, I said again, I think it was a distraction.
How does MI5 work alongside MI6? For the ordinary citizen, I think there's a view that MI5 is to do with internal work in the country, whereas MI6 is abroad. And I know that's not the case.
Well, that's broadly the case, but we work very closely together. The sort of le carré view that the two organisations are constantly at each other's throats is entirely fictional.
Of course.
And we both help each other, as we do with GCHQ. It's a close-knit community. And of course, I should add at this stage, of course, the other very important partner for MI5 is the police, who have a very difficult job because they're out there on the streets dealing with the public order, dealing with the real problems. And I'm delighted that long after I've left, the counter-terrorist part of the Metropolitan Police is in the same building and integrated with the counter-terrorist part of MI5, with representatives of the Five Eyes community. So there's been a move forward of real integration and cooperation from which the public can only benefit.
And I think that must have applied very much in 2005 with the 7/7 bombings, in which you were involved in that close contact with the police. And the record shows that you made a tannoy message to your staff, which was described as very powerful at that time, but you sent a third of your staff home. Now, give us an insight into that.
I don't remember what I said on the tannoy. It was after a day at Cobra. If you recall, the G8 with Putin was happening at Glen Eagles.
Glen Eagles,
And I think it was that evening, it may have been the next morning. But I had learnt something from the military called battle rhythm. And I expected us to be flat out for some time on this, our role being to help the police in understanding this crime, this atrocity, this horror. And therefore I wanted people to come into work fresh. So we set up, people were pulled in from all other subjects to focus on this, almost all other subjects. And I wanted people to go home and come back fresh.
But you had so much experience in global and domestic issues before that. Some would say that if they had to reflect on the most dangerous moment in the Cold War period, it would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you have another view on that, and it goes back to 1983. And then you had a link with Oleg Gordievsky, and you met him, I believe, when he was smuggled out of Finland. And you're also on record as saying he helped avert nuclear war. Can you give us into that period where you say the world was at peril more than
well,
any
we
other time?
we were in a lot of peril at Cuba, which
Of course
we're probably old enough to remember.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very much, it's Cuba that I remember.
Well,
So
I remember it.
I'm looking to be educated about 1983.
And actually, just on Cuba, it's extraordinary to read the tapes, because Kennedy was being pressed by his military to bomb Cuba. And in 1983...
With nuclear weapons.
Exactly. In 1983, the Russians misinterpreted a NATO exercise, which we were engaged in Germany, as being anticipating a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Well, this wasn't our intention, and it wasn't what we were trying to do, and it illustrates actually the dangers of misunderstanding between nations. And we had information the Russians were thinking like this, and we were able to unscramble the exercise and defuse the situation. But it was my recollection is that they were arming their silos, their nuclear silos, and we were quite close to something very dangerous indeed.
Tell us a bit about Gordievsky.
I think he was an extraordinarily brave man. He died recently. I think he's written his own history. He was motivated by a dislike of what the Soviet Union stood for. So his decision to move to the West was ideological. Mm-hmm. It wasn't bribery or money or anything like that. It was a principle.
Mm-hmm. And if we go back to the period of Blunt and others in the 30s and 40s, it seemed that Cambridge undergraduates, whatever, had a penchant for Russia.
Well, I was at Oxford, so this is what explains it.
Give us a bit an idea of the mindset of the country at that time.
I think actually it's possible to understand those spies, and I think actually it's a role of intelligence, as you said earlier, to try and put yourself in the position of the people you're looking at. I think they saw the rise of fascism in Europe. Mm-hmm. They had a delusion that Soviet communism was equable and fair. And when some of them were recruited, it was before the full horrors of the Gulag and Stalin's murder of millions and millions of people was out. People who retained membership of the Communist Party after Hungary and after Khrushchev's speech explaining what had happened, find it far more difficult to understand that. But in the 30s, when you saw the rise of fascism, you thought it was preferable to, some people thought it was preferable to support communism. I don't agree with it, but I can understand it.
Well, that's where history comes in, and particularly this time in the world. I suppose it's very important to have a historical dimension.
Well, yes, because we all hoped, I think, that the past history of Russia wouldn't prevail, and that at the end of the Soviet Union we would have a potential partner. And that was one of the reasons why Putin was with us for the G8 in 2005.
Oh, you met him there?
And I met him when he came back to London. But actually, we were wrong in that, because Russia is extremely hostile to the West. And we've seen it in all sorts of ways.
He seemed to protrude a pleasant face at that particular time.
I wouldn't quite describe him as that, Lord Speaker. I thought he was.
I'm looking for your penetrating analysis here.
Well, I didn't anticipate that within a year he'd be ordering the murder on London streets of Litvinenko. Mm-hmm. But I thought he was quite an unpleasant man. Mm.
And we have still to be alert to foreign governments or whatever in terms of our own safety as a country.
Well, of course, since the invasion of Ukraine, and the various things I read about that the Russians have been doing here, sabotage, intelligence collection, attacking people and so on, I'm not sure that Fiona Hill, who you'll know who I mean, who did the defence review, I think she may be right in saying we're already at war with Russia. It's a different sort of war, but the hostility, the cyber attacks, the physical attacks, the intelligence work is extensive. And
she was one of the three participants.
Exactly so.
With the defence.
And she probably knows more about Putin than anybody else.
Yeah, and she was very close to the American administration previously.
Well, she was on the National Security Council under Trump 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then in 1988, Lockerbie happened. 270 people died. 259 passengers and crew were on the plane. I was a member of Parliament at that time, and I remember being brought back that evening for a statement at 10 o'clock to a very shocked House of Commons. And the reverberations of that still last to today. We've had the BBC, we've had Sky making documentaries of that. You were there at that particular time with Lockerbie. The immediate effect we can look at, but there's a medium, long-term effect as well.
Yes, you can't have a horror of that scale without it affecting people for the rest of their lives and on through the generations. I went to Lockerbie very soon afterwards, set up an intelligence cell in the school. It was the school holidays. And the Dumfries and Galloway police were doing a valiant job, but they're a tiny police force. They were helped by Strathclyde, and gradually we built up records. There was a collection of evidence across a vast range, something like 800 square miles. And of course, that evening, it was a very, very windy evening, and there are 6 routes from London to America. And in 5 of those routes, the plane would have been to the west of Ireland, and our chances of discovering what had happened would have been very difficult indeed. But as it was still over Scotland, which was very unfortunate for Lockerbie, and of course, obviously for the passengers, who were mainly students returning home. But it did mean that it was possible to collect evidence and to build a very strong picture of what had happened. And that is what happened. But it was a major, major effort in which we were helped by the Americans, of course.
And did you feel it came to the right conclusion?
Yes.
Because it's still a source.
Well, I can understand that people, there've been, I'm afraid, some scandals like the post office and infected blood, and there are some people who will always assume, in my experience wrongly, that governments cover up the truth. And of course, sometimes they do. But in this case, the evidence was compelling. There was a circuit board retrieved, part circuit board, that was sold from a batch to the Libyans by the manufacturer.
From Malta? Was that the Malta?
Yeah. Well, no, the Malta connection was that the circuit board, which was for the bomb, was part of a batch, was recovered, and was part of a batch that was sold by a Swiss company to the Libyans. Yeah. So we knew that. And then gradually it became clear there was a baby grow that was clearly near the seat of the bomb, covered in explosive, only made in one place in Malta. And gradually the evidence accumulated that the bomb was put on there. And then it went to Frankfurt and then to London and then exploded in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. We are living in very turbulent times. Perhaps given your lifelong experience, it's just a different type of turbulence from what has gone on before. But, there's one headline this morning in one of the newspapers, and we're just looking at it for the sake of headline, nothing else, but the country's going to rack and ruin, whatever. Give us a bit of an optimistic view here.
Well, funnily enough, I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday. I think that every day I find human kindness, and I think it's really important to hold on to that. That said, I wish governments, this one and past ones, would be straighter with the public, would explain the difficulties of what we can afford, what we can't afford, what the priorities have to be, because government is about choice, as is intelligence work.
As you've said that,
You cannot
and it's uncertain as well.
Intelligence work is very uncertain.
Yeah.
You can't hope to prevent everything. You have to make choices. Are we going to do this or that or the other? And government's the same. You can't do everything. You don't have the money and the resources and the people. Certainly in intelligence, when something occurs, it could be that we were at fault. The MI5 was at fault. Of course it could be. And in those occasions, you need to put your hand up and say, we messed up. But there are other times when something happens and with all the best intentions in the world, you couldn't have prevented it. And it's only clear with hindsight. So there's different sorts of failure. There's culpable failure, which is, absolutely take that. And governments, intelligence organisations, departments, police services, corporations have all encountered culpable failure. But there's also failure where you do your best and it's not culpable.
Could I take you on, and I'll come back to the young people element, but you said that the solutions are political and economic. There's an issue about China at the moment and our relations with China. Yes. Maybe Fiona Hill was talking about America and China or whatever else, the real tensions that are there. But I'm very conscious that China from 2013, President Xi, he established the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, that's linked with 150 countries around the world, particularly developed countries or developing countries with contracts and investments. And I believe the latest estimate of that is there's almost about $1.5 trillion worth of these, 780 trillion worth construction and 550 with the non-financial areas. So China's got themselves embedded, particularly in the developing world. And there's this combination of hard power from the Chinese, as you know, where they developed it, but the soft power element. Do we risk, and I'm talking about the West here, do we risk losing the soft power battles?
Yes. If you look at, when I was working for the Wellcome Trust, which is what I did after MI5, I travelled a lot to areas of the world where we funded research. And one of the things I remember very strongly was the HIV work funded by the Americans in Africa.
That was under George Bush, wasn't it?
It was George W. Bush.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you'd go to a pretty primitive hospital with people on pallets on the ground, but the George W. Bush funded AIDS wing was a different scale. For Americans to stop all of that and for our cutting back on aid, and means that we leave space for your friendly Chinese diplomat. So I think we, far from containing China, which is what we would all like to do if we had the power to do it, if we withdraw from the world, they can move in because they have a strong economic base. So I think soft power in all sorts of ways. I'm also involved with the charity Halo, and they do fantastic work making.
So when Princess Diana was
that's exactly that's the image, clearing a minefield. But it doesn't just deal with mines; it deals with munitions. But its purpose is to make communities able to live again on the land and be sustainable. And it employs and trains local people to do this work, to demine. And it's struggling at the moment because of cuts from donors. And soft power, whether it's the BBC World Service, whether it's aid, whether it's demining, all contribute importantly to our influence in the world, as well as being of humanitarian importance.
You made reference there to migration, and you've also said very, very openly that, we've got China, yes, we've got Russia, yes, we've got Ukraine, yes, we've got the African countries, but we've got climate change. Yes. And the impact in climate change on migration would seem to be growingly significant in the years to come.
It's bound to be. I'm often asked what I think the greatest threats to the UK are, and of course I have no inside knowledge. I haven't seen intelligence for many, many years. But it's fairly clear to me that the greatest threat is of climate change, and we're frying the planet, and we're actually not doing enough to stop it. And climate's going to affect water, desertification, migration of people to escape the heat where they can move. It's going to lead to food shortages. It's going to lead to tropical diseases moving away from the tropics, north and south. The effect of heat on human beings, apart from the provision of food and water, is going to be dramatic. We're already seeing this. It's already with us. And the question to the science is clear on this, and we need to follow the science, as in so many things.
Mm. In fact, the weekend I was listening from our own correspondent at the BBC with Kate Adie, and one of the features was the tensions between Mexico and Texas about water and the agreements that have been signed by Mexico and Texas, causing a lot of tension there. So I suppose that's just but one example of that.
Well, ultimately, we're all connected.
Exactly.
And, you know, rivers go through many countries, and if one country dams it and keeps it, you starve the next one. But there's all sorts of problems.
None of us have got a script for climate change wholly, but how should we approach this, given your experience in intelligence, your knowledge worldwide with countries experiencing tensions and climate change? How should we be looking at that, and what sort of narrative should we be presenting?
We need to find allies. We need to work together. We need to work with America, with China, with Europe, with Asia. And at the moment, alliances are breaking, not coming together. And one of the things that's surprising to me about America is that it is fighting its traditional allies generally, and yet we need alliances to deal with these global issues. But that can't work unless there's an agreed basis of understanding that this is a serious problem. And until there is that, it's very hard to see what progress can be made. And of course, China is critical to this, as well as America.
And Chris Patton, who featured in one of my podcasts, Chris, as you know, been governor of Hong Kong. The Chinese had the worst words in his mouth, and we won't repeat them here. But Chris said that the Chinese civil servants are about the smartest that you can find, and he had a good relationship with them. So is it analogous to the terrorism situation? Whilst you condemn the act, that you must keep the channels open?
Yes, I think so. It's keep the channels open while recognising what sort of government they are and their treatment of their people.
Yeah,
that's important.
Talking about young people, how do we speak to young people nowadays? What do we say to them? Because, you know, it seems as if we've shortchanged them in many ways, in the type of world that they're going into, whether socially, economically, and we can go on socially with phones and AI and whatever, but socially and economically is different to the one that we were raised in.
It's tougher. I mean, for a start, they're all my grandchildren are very anxious about climate change and frustrated that not more is being done. I think secondly, the cost of living. I mean, they pay enormous rents to live in the outer reaches of London. And the amount left over from their salary or their wages is doesn't give them much scope to do other things. I think I have a further anxiety, which is the horrors on the internet, things that you and I have never looked at or never seen in our lives, John.
Yeah.
I mean, torture, murder, all sorts of horrors, which are bad enough for adults to look at. But when children of 10 can get access to this stuff on their telephone, what are we allowing to happen to impressionable minds which are not yet fully developed by the availability of appalling images on screens? And that worries me tremendously.
In that regard, the House of Lords has done excellent work in online safety.
Indeed it has, but there's more to do because these images are still there and the tech companies don't take them down.
So I speak to lots of young people, so I'm asking you for your view when you're introduced, you're from the House of Lords. What do you say? How would you characterise the House of Lords, and how would you convey the real work that's going on here?
I think that the outer image of the House of Lords as people waltzing around in ermine and red robes is a very unfortunate one, because actually the work that gets done here, in particular in the scrutiny of legislation, is invaluable. Legislation quite often comes here from the Commons in a messy state, with contradictions with existing legislation, with lack of clarity. And I've often heard lawyers in our house say things like, if I was having to try a case involving this law, I don't know what these paragraphs mean. So there's a cross-party effort to improve draft legislation, and I think that shows the Lords at its best, suggesting amendments, arguing about the detail, work that's time-consuming. Some would regard it as tedious. I don't. I think it's extraordinarily important, but which has quite often not been done by the Commons. Of course, there are other things here that are important. I think some of the select committees come up with really interesting work and detailed examination of issues and recommendations for government. Debates can be fascinating. They don't change a lot very often, but the work of the select committees and the work on legislation are the ones I pick out.
From your personal experience, could you give us an idea of how essential good law is?
We've got too much law.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've got a number of laws that should be repealed. We've got too many tax rules. I would love to see greater simplification. But if we're going to introduce criminal or civil offences onto the statute book, we've got to be very confident that it's clear what we're trying to do, and that what we're trying to do won't have a perverse result. And I think the legislation I've been most closely involved with has been national security legislation. And I think always, since I've been here, the Lords has improved it. Quite often on that subject you can get cross-party consensus, but usually only after digging around, improving, rephrasing, adding, subtracting, amending. And that's really important work. I'm a political with a small p. As you know, we can't vote, but I've voted for different parties in my lifetime. I don't have the derision of politics that people sometimes have. I admire people who commit to being a politician. It can be a pretty thankless task, quite abusive very often. It's not going to make you millions. But I believe that public service, which is what politicians, the best, set out to do, is an honourable profession. And I believe public service in the civil service, in the intelligence community, in the armed forces, in the police services, is in principle an honourable profession, because what you're trying to do, not always with success, is protect the lives of your citizens and improve the lives of your citizens. That sounds, I know it sounds noble, and I know there are failings from that aspiration, but many people who I've known have gone into politics, certainly into intelligence and into the other areas I've mentioned, like the civil service, have done so for good motives.
And what qualities do you think are most important, in intelligence and in life generally? And I believe that in terms of the Nolan principles, which you agree with entirely, you are thinking that an extra principle should be added about engaging with one another.
Yes, the Nolan principles are 20 years old, and they say nothing about this. I hope I can do them by heart: integrity, honesty, openness, objectivity, accountability, leadership. I've missed out one. But what none of them say is behaviour towards each other, treating people with courtesy, in being interested in differing views to your own, possibly changing yours as a result of that. Discussion, debate, courtesy. These are all things I was brought up to try and aspire to, and the best of politics is about that.
How would you define leadership then?
It's so many things. I don't think there's a template. I think people do it individually. But what I don't think it is an assumption that you're right and you march out in front and everybody will follow. I think it's about bringing people with you, and to do that, they have to know that you care about them, that you're concerned for their welfare, that you want their help, that you're a partnership with them. I mean, those are sort of headlines.
So it's walking alongside people.
Yes.
And I can understand it fully.
But lots of people do it differently, and in my career I've seen people and thought, they're a brilliant leader, I can copy that. I've also seen people who I've thought, well, if ever I'm a leader, I'm not going to behave like that.
Yeah. Let me take you on to the Wellcome Trust, because you chaired that and you reorganised it very successfully, and Julia Gillard took over from you, and we were privileged to host a Lord Speaker's lecture with yourself and her. Now, that's dealing with science. Science has come under the cosh a little bit from some people, you know, oh, we don't need experts and science is unreliable. But I have got a scientific background, and all science is provisional until you get down to the last variable on it. So that's what science is. Give me your experience in the Wellcome Trust, because it's performed an invaluable service.
It was a decision of mine after MI5, John, that I did not want to be a security advisor to a company. My knowledge was going to decline, and I wanted to do something different, and I chose science. And I joined Wellcome's board, and I joined Imperial's board, and I was fortunate enough to end up as chair of both. I found it, and still do, thrilling what science is discovering. Every day there's new reports, new papers written. Wellcome's an extraordinary charity. It's immensely rich, currently over 40 billion pounds in its endowment. And that means you can do and try and do a lot of good in the world, as I believe it does, funding research, medical research in over 70 countries. I was really privileged to be part of it. I found it fascinating and absorbing. I liked the people I met, the scientists who were focused on trying to find solutions to health and other issues. And I am still excited to read what the latest decisions have been, discoveries have been. And Wellcome developed a new strategy when I was there. We had a number of priorities, which we agreed before COVID, which I might say people in Wellcome predicted. We established with the Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and the governments of India and China in January 2017 a coalition to prepare for epidemics. And that was, you know, a good 2 years, a good 3 years before COVID hit. So I can't take credit for that. It wasn't my idea, but the fact there were people thinking about this at that stage. So infection and the worry about antimicrobial resistance, i.e. resistance to antibiotics, were very key priorities. Also mental health, which has been neglected in terms of research.
In fact, the US Surgeon General gave a Lord Speaker's lecture a year or so back, and his number one priority in that position, he said, is mental health.
And of course, the hostility to proven treatments of vaccines and the lower take-up of vaccines is very concerning indeed, because we've faced the possibility of public health going backwards rather than making progress if people don't have the confidence to take these vaccines. And for that, I think science has got to improve its communication of these issues to try and help give people reassurance, which in many cases they don't have. And, you know, that's of real concern.
Maybe I could end up by asking you, how did you develop your talent for reading upside down? And is there any question I've got here that I shouldn't have asked you?
I'm finding your writing reasonably difficult. Climate change, are we there? China. It's a professional talent.
Okay, what questions have I missed then?
That's up to you.
Right, but you are quite proficient in that.
Well, I try to avoid people thinking that I'm reading their letters upside down. But when I joined MI5 and discovered that we read people's correspondence, I was rather shocked. You know, I was brought up you don't read other people's letters. I was brought up, you don't listen to other people's telephones. Somebody was on the landline, when you picked it up, was talking, you put it down. I had to counter that upbringing in MI5 because it was necessary to do that, to counter the people who threatened us, but to do it in a proper legal basis with proper authority and scrutiny. Right.
So in many ways you've changed as you go through life, and that's natural that we change, and I think it was Cardinal Newman had said, a person who doesn't change hasn't lived. So hopefully we all change in some way. Last bit of advice for young people in terms how they go through their life.
Consider you may be wrong. I think the most dangerous leaders are those who lack any sort of humility. Set off, do what you best, do it to the best standard you can, but always just don't assume that you've got it right. So some self-scrutiny is rather important, but equally, if you can, find friends and colleagues who will give you frank feedback, who say to you, I think you're getting this wrong, I think that was unreasonable, whatever. And instead of bristling when that happens, to accept it.
A lovely note on which to end. So, Eliza, thank you very much for your time, your experience, and it fits in exactly with my ambitions for this podcast, to demonstrate to people the type of people that are in the House of Lords, the various talents that they have, and their personalities and how they're conveyed. So I'm really, really grateful and indebted to you for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to come back to a room that's familiar to me.
I'm only a tenant here.
I never expected to be here.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you.